Hello, and welcome to week 46 of our 2 year Bible study. We start off this week in Psalm chapter 71. And in this psalm, we see the psalmist saying that the Lord Himself is the place of refuge throughout life. And so while we look for refuge in different places, ultimately it is the Lord who provides that refuge and the Lord Himself who is that place of refuge that we need. And of course, when we have situations in our life where we are feeling vulnerable and unsafe, this is a good psalm for us to use as a framework of prayer to God. Additionally, in Psalm chapter 94, we have a psalm that speaks about God certainly bringing justice and rescuing the righteous. And not that these were written together, but these have purposely been put together in a reading because the one, Psalm 71 says that the Lord is that place of refuge and that God will certainly bring justice and rescue those who are seeking refuge in Him and rescuing the righteous. Psalm 119 is known by many of us as the longest psalm. So we're going to go over the different sections of it. Each of the sections are letters of the alphabet, and each verse starts with that letter of the alphabet in the Hebrew alphabet. There are several different words that are used throughout in terms of God's revelation. And the first three sets of words are the law, His word, or testimony. And this speaks to God's revelation of His will. So making His will known comes through the law, the word, and testimony. And then you have ordinances, commandments, and statutes. And the ordinances, commandments, and statutes are our proper response to His revelation. So God has revealed Himself in some way through the law, the word, the testimony. We follow the ordinances, commands, and statutes as a proper response to that revelation. And then you have precepts and promises. And the precepts and promises are the results of responding to God's will. So we see the outcome of giving Him proper response for the revelation that He has given. So in the first section, Aleph talks about blessing through God's word. In the second section, Bet, it talks about focus and consuming God's word for purity. Verse 11 is a well known verse. I've hidden your word in my heart that I might not sin against you. So it talks about this focus and consuming of God's word and for the sake of purity. In the next section, Gimel, we see the request for insight through God's word. And then in the next section, we see, may your word guide me away from temptation. So we need insight into God's word, and that insight can guide us away from temptation. In the next section, hey, the path to life can be found in God's word. And so that idea of path is also the way that we live our life. In the next section, it talks about the truth of God's word guiding my life. So we trust that God's word is truthful and that it is an appropriate guide for our lives. In the Zayin section, it talks about God's word bringing comfort in the midst of suffering. And in the next section, it talks about commitment to pursuing God's word. So despite the suffering, we still are committed to pursuing God's word. In the next section, it talks about my affliction taught me the truth of God's word. So we actually, in suffering, in affliction, recognize the truth of what God has said that He would do for those who are suffering and in affliction. In the Yod section, we have been created to follow God's word in both good and bad times. And so recognizing that this is part of our the fulfillment of the purpose of who we are. In the Kaf section, it talks about how I will trust the promises of God's word in the midst of affliction. And then in the next section, it says that God's word lasts forever. And this is necessary for us to recognize, especially in the midst of suffering and affliction, because this is how we know that the promises that God has made, His word is going to come true because it lasts forever. In the Mem section, it talks about God's word making me wise. And in the Nun section, There is a commitment to following God's word in all circumstances. In the next section, we see a request for God to keep me focused on his word. In the AN section, we see that this cry for God to show himself faithful according to his word. And then in the pay section, we see the request to redeem me as I pursue the light of God's word. In the next section, we display the righteousness of God's word. In the next section, we see that in distress, we trust in the promises of God's word. In the rest section, we look to God's faithfulness in trial and suffering. In the next section, we have a prayer that our deepest desire would be God's word. And then lastly, in the Tav section, we have a request for blessing according to God's word. So that's quite a bit of material that's covered, and especially when we use that overview of law, word, testimony relating to God's revelation of his will, ordinances, commandments, and statutes, our proper response to his revelation, and the precepts and promises, the results of responding to God's will, then we can see that through God's word, he really does light our path through his revelation so that we can respond properly and see the blessings of God's glory displayed in our lives. Well, we move back over to 1 Kings chapter 3, and here we see that Solomon is approached by God and offered to be given anything, and Solomon requests wisdom here. And certainly Solomon had a good model in David. David had his problems, but generally there's prosperity during David's time. There's military peace. David was honored. He had a long life. And Solomon, who was probably approximately 20 years old at this point, is concerned that he wants to rule like him. And so he attributes much of that prosperity, that peace, the honor, the long life to the wisdom that David had in life. And Solomon wants to be wise like him. And in so doing, really honors God and glorifies God in that request. In Second Chronicles chapter 1, this is a parallel to the First Kings 3 passage, but also speaks about how when David brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, he brought a shelter there for it, but he left the tabernacle in Gibeon. And so we almost have like two places of worship, where the Ark of the Covenant is and where the tabernacle is. And both places become places of worship here. In verse 16, it says that Solomon's horses were imported from Egypt and from Q in verse 16. And we see already a hint that Solomon's not going to follow everything that God has placed in his word, because Deuteronomy 17 verse 16 says not to go back to Egypt for horses. So already at the beginning of Solomon's reign, we see some fudging on the edges of what God expected of him as a king. As we go back to 1 Kings chapter 4, we have a listing of Solomon's officials and his governors, as well as the daily provisions, the notoriety of his wisdom. And really, David and Solomon together show God faithful in fulfilling his covenantal promises. During their two reigns, we see so much of the promises that God had made to the Israelites coming true. In Psalm chapter 17, we have a Psalm of Solomon, and he speaks about how there's prosperity and justice under the king's rule. And to some degree, he's talking about himself, but ultimately he's talking about God being the king, and really Solomon just being his son, or the instrument through which God brings this prosperity and justice to Israel.